late December 2022, Constance Marten and Mark Gordon were living transiently. Their movements on the surface seemed like nothing more than the whims of an erratic couple, moving from place to place, paying cash, hiding from the authorities. But beneath that surface, a deeper story was emerging. The first significant clue came on December 20th, 2022, when Marten and Gordon booked a holiday cottage in Northumberland. It was here that Marten claimed to have given birth to their daughter, Victoria, unaided. No medical professionals, no witnesses. Just the couple in a remote cottage living outside the boundaries of normal society. On Christmas Eve, she told authorities later, she brought a life into the world, a life that was immediately hidden from the world. There were no birth certificates, no records, just a story of a solitary birth that would begin their descent into chaos. It wasn't just the birth itself that was concealed, it was the child's very existence. On December 28th, 2022, the owners of the Northumberland cottage discovered the state in which the couple had left the property: foul, unsanitary, the remnants of a disjointed, reckless existence. Candles burned down to stubs, a bed cover stained with curry, cat litter scattered across the floor. It was as if the couple had deliberately chosen to leave behind a trail of disregard. On that same day, their Suzuki car broke down on the M18 motorway. A recovery driver later reported that the couple appeared strangely unprepared for a journey of this magnitude, with no sign of a baby in tow. It was this moment, the first tangible instance of neglect, that set the stage for the deadly arc that would follow. The couple's flight took on a new urgency when they continued moving across England in the early days of January 2023. On January 5th, 2023, the couple's abandoned car was discovered by authorities on the M61 motorway near Bolton. Inside, police found a placenta wrapped in a towel, a burner phone, and Marten's passport. An ominous clue, but no baby. As police scrambled to make sense of the scene, it became clear that their disappearance wasn't merely a case of escaping the law. It was part of a larger, more disturbing pattern. But what truly struck the authorities, and would haunt the investigation, was the absence of Victoria. The child was nowhere to be found, even though Marten and Gordon had already started down the road of extraordinary lengths to conceal her. On January 6th, 2023, they checked into a Premier Inn hotel in Harwich, Essex, paying cash, and continued their covert journey. In the days that followed, their behavior remained paradoxical. On one hand, the couple took extreme measures to avoid being found, changing locations frequently, using multiple burner phones. On the other, they spent lavishly. They made expensive, long-distance taxi journeys across the country, one from Liverpool to Harwich, another from London to New Haven, that would attract attention, but they seemed to have no care for the money they were spending. These contradictions were glaring. They moved to avoid detection, but in doing so, they exposed themselves. It wasn't just paranoia. They had the means to remain hidden, but chose not to. This duality would shape the entire case. Was their flight truly born from desperation? Or was it driven by something darker? A rejection of everything that could help them? As Marten and Gordon traveled deeper into their increasingly isolated world, Victoria's life was coming to a tragic end. The timeline of her death was marked by an eerie silence. On January 9th, 2023, Marten later claimed Victoria died. But how? Why? These questions would linger in the air for months to come. By January 12th, 2023, the couple was seen walking together along Cantercrow Hill in New Haven, but there was no baby visible. This marked the beginning of a long stretch of time in which there were no confirmed sightings of them. It was as if they had disappeared into the vastness of the British countryside, hiding the truth behind layers of silence. The absence of Victoria was a haunting presence. Was she alive? Had she died in the cold, left to perish in the tent they had set up to hide from the authorities? No one knew for sure, but one thing was certain. The couple was on the move, hiding their every move from view. For weeks, the trail went cold. Then, in mid-February, sightings began to emerge from the Brighton area. A dog walker saw the couple pushing a buggy, but did not see a baby. Another driver saw Marten with something under her puffer jacket. February 19th, a witness saw the couple with their blue tent and reported seeing Marten carrying a very young baby with a wobbly head, no hat, and no socks. In the spaces where there should have been the sound of a baby's cry, there was only a growing sense of dread. Then, the break came. After weeks of pursuit, the couple was finally spotted in the suburban streets of Brighton on February 27th, 2023. A local resident, Dale Cooley, recognized them from news reports and immediately alerted the police. The arrest, captured on body-worn cameras, was as tense and defiant as anyone could expect. Marten's words were chilling in their simplicity. You can't arrest someone for hiding a pregnancy. This was not a woman in denial. It was a woman whose sense of responsibility had collapsed into a defense of her actions. She wasn't just trying to evade the law. She was trying to rewrite the narrative of her life, to assert control over the version of events that would be told. Her words spoke of a deep disconnect. A mother who had abandoned her child, who was now trying to distance herself from that fact. A mother who had lost all sense of accountability. When asked about the child, Marten and Gordon refused to answer. The tension that had been building for weeks now reached its peak. The authorities knew they had to find Victoria. But even as they questioned Marten and Gordon, they still did not know where she was, or what had happened to her. The next day, the search for Victoria became a massive operation, involving over 200 officers, helicopters, drones, and sniffer dogs. The search area spanned over 90 square miles of rugged terrain in the South Downs. But as the search wore on, the questions grew heavier. How had a child been allowed to slip so far from view? How had a family with so much privilege allowed such a tragedy to unfold? The search itself was fraught with the same tension that had underpinned the couple's flight. The sense that Victoria's death was not an accident, but a consequence of a series of deliberate choices. On March 1st, 2023, the search culminated in a heartbreaking discovery. Victoria's body was found inside a disused allotment shed near where the couple had been arrested. She was wrapped in a little bag for life, her tiny body left abandoned like discarded rubbish. The weight of that discovery was inescapable. The baby's remains were found with no clear answer as to how or why she had died. Was it neglect? Was it a tragic accident? The case had now shifted from a search for a missing child to an investigation into a mother and father's complicity in the death of their daughter. The question that lingered in the air was simple. How could this happen? How could a mother, with every resource at her disposal, fail so completely in her duty to protect her child? And yet, even after the body was found, the answers remained elusive. Marten and Gordon's trial would become a battleground for competing narratives. One side accusing them of gross negligence and neglect, the other painting them as victims of a broken system. But no matter what the court would decide, one truth remained undeniable. A child had died under circumstances that no one could explain, and the search for answers would continue long after the courtroom had emptied. The case would never be fully resolved until the truth of what happened to baby Victoria was finally laid bare. And that truth, for now, seemed to remain just beyond reach. How much of this tragedy was a result of deliberate action? And how much was the result of reckless disregard for the life they were supposed to protect? The story, it seemed, was far from over. This wasn't just a disappearance. This was a story we couldn't understand. The voice of the lead investigator echoed in the courtroom, his eyes locked on the jury. This wasn't a case of missing persons. It was something darker, something deeper. A child was dead, and the truth of her death was slipping further from reach with every passing moment. The search for Victoria Marten was more than an investigation. It was a desperate race against time, a cry for answers that seemed to dissipate with each new twist in the case. The question remained unanswered. What happened to Victoria? When the authorities finally closed in on Constance Marten and Mark Gordon on February 27th, 2023, they were alone. There was no sign of baby Victoria. Their arrest, captured on body-worn cameras, revealed more than just two fugitives caught in the act. It revealed a woman who was determined to shield herself from the consequences of her actions. Marten's refusal to cooperate during the arrest only deepened the officer's suspicions. She insisted on giving a false name, Arabella, and challenged the legality of her detention. You can't arrest someone for hiding a pregnancy, she argued. But the chilling refusal to answer any questions about the child, her daughter, was the real betrayal. Her body language was defiant, protective even. There was no panic, no urgency to explain the whereabouts of the baby. Instead, there was a quiet, disturbing resolve. For Constance Marten, this was not just a moment of crisis. It was a moment of deep, inward rationalization. She had convinced herself that the world had misunderstood her choices. She had, after all, been trying to protect her daughter from a society she saw as oppressive. In stark contrast, Gordon's behavior was equally revealing. He was not silent. Instead, as officers pleaded for information, he complained about being hungry and demanded food and drink from his shopping bag. There was no remorse, no apparent concern for the child, just a focus on his own immediate needs. It was a chilling display, as if both had retreated into an unspoken narrative where their actions were justified. With no sign of the baby and Marten and Gordon refusing to cooperate, the case took on a new urgency. The police rearrested the couple on suspicion of gross negligence manslaughter, .5. The implications were dire, but the truth about Victoria's death remained elusive. Was it the neglect of her parents that killed her, or something else? Over 200 officers were dispatched to the rugged South Downs. Helicopters flew overhead, and sniffer dogs scoured the terrain. The search was methodical, relentless. The authorities needed to find her body. They had to understand how such an innocent life could be lost. The search operation lasted for days, extending over a 90-square-mile area. In this vast expanse, there was no definitive lead, just a growing sense of dread. How could such a small, fragile life have disappeared without a trace? The longer it took to find her, the more questions arose. Were they looking in the wrong place? Were the couple's lies designed to mislead them entirely? The sense of frustration among the search teams was palpable. It was not just about finding a body. It was about uncovering the story behind her death. No one could shake the feeling that the couple knew far more than they were letting on. But they refused to break. On March 1st, 2023, the search culminated in a discovery that would haunt everyone involved. Victoria Marten's body was found inside a dilapidated allotment shed, not far from where the couple had been arrested. She was inside a Lidl bag for life, wrapped in a plastic bag and covered with rubbish. The image was deeply unsettling. A tiny child left in a manner that suggested utter indifference. How could a mother, one with immense wealth and resources, abandon her child in this way? There was a layer of brutality to it, not just in the abandonment, but in the fact that the child had been discarded as if she were nothing. At first, no one knew for sure how she had died. The body was so decomposed that a clear cause of death was hard to determine. The medical examiner later suggested that hypothermia, smothering, or co-sleeping related causes could be possibilities, but none could be definitively proven. The forensic ambiguity only added to the frustration. Was this a case of neglect? Or was there something more sinister at play? The discovery of her body was the breakthrough, but it was also a chilling reminder of the limits of the investigation. Even with her body found, there were still more questions than answers. Was this death the tragic consequence of desperate circumstances? Or was it a deliberate act of cruelty? The search for the truth had reached its peak, but the real journey was only beginning. As the discovery spread through the media, the emotional and psychological toll on the public became evident. There was outrage, yes, but also a deep sense of confusion. The couple had led a life of privilege. They could have lived anywhere, done anything, and yet they chose to live off the grid, to hide from society, to expose their child to such horrific conditions. The deeper tragedy, however, lay not just in the baby's death, but in the unraveling of Marten's narrative. She had been born into wealth, raised in a grand estate, but her actions, her refusal to face the reality of her situation, had created an impossible situation for everyone around her. Her family's attempts to intervene, to find her, had been ignored. And in Gordon's silence, there was something even more troubling. A man with a violent past, a history of crime that stretched back to his youth in Florida, had now taken on a new role, a protector of a family built on deceit and evasion. His testimony throughout the investigation was marked by contradictions and self-serving explanations. Was he simply the product of a system that had failed him? Or was he a deliberate participant in the endangerment of a child? The discovery of Victoria's body didn't resolve the case. It deepened it. Now the focus would shift to trial, to the legal battle over what had truly happened to the child. But emotionally, the damage had already been done. The search was not just about finding a body. It was about searching for answers that, as the weeks passed, seemed more and more out of reach. Victoria had been abandoned, neglected, and finally discarded. Her body left in a cold shed, covered by refuse, as if she had never mattered. The two people who were supposed to protect her, the ones with every resource at their disposal, had instead chosen to hide behind their privilege, their evasions, and their secrets. The case had only begun, but the emotional weight was already immense. In the coming months, as the trial began and the narrative shifted into legal debates, one question would continue to linger. How had it come to this? The discovery of Victoria Marten's body was just the beginning of a more complex and heartbreaking story. The search for truth had been marked by contradictions, emotional distance, and an unrelenting desire to uncover the reality behind a child's tragic end. But even as the case moved toward the courtroom, there was a haunting question that would remain unanswered. Who truly held the responsibility for this young life's loss? At the heart of the courtroom, two lives are on trial. One is a lost child, the other, her parents. The question that hangs in the air is simple but profound. Who was responsible for Victoria Marten's death? Was it neglect or something darker? The trial that followed would not only determine guilt, but also what kind of society would tolerate such a loss. The courtroom was filled with an atmosphere of intense anticipation. The evidence was stark. Victoria Marten was dead, and her parents were standing trial for her death. Yet, as the trial began on January 25th, 2024, something else lingered in the air, a profound, gnawing sense of confusion. For all the brutality of the facts, for all the pain of Victoria's death, the case wasn't as clear-cut as it should have been. Constance Marten, seated with her legal team, appeared stoic but unwavering. She would not be swayed, not by the prosecution's case, nor by the grief that seemed to hang over the courtroom like a weight. She had already constructed a narrative of victimhood, one where she was simply trying to protect her child, even if that meant running away from a society she considered oppressive. For Marten, the trial wasn't just about defending her actions, but about validating the life choices that had led her here. Mark Gordon, on the other hand, sat quietly beside her, his body language closed off, retreating into a silence that seemed to say more than words ever could. This was a man who had lived a life of violence and evasion, and now, here he was again, caught in the web of his own choices. His calm exterior was deceptive. Inside, he was grappling with the enormity of the charges against him, even if he would never admit it. Was he complicit in his daughter's death? Or was he just another victim of a flawed system? The prosecution's case was relentless. Tom Lidl KC, the lead prosecutor, laid out the brutal facts with methodical precision. The central argument was clear. Victoria had been subjected to a life of neglect, a life spent in a tent during the winter months, exposed to the elements, with no access to proper care or warmth. Lidl didn't mince words. Her death was the inevitable result of grossly negligent parenting. Her parents had the means to care for her, but they chose not to. The evidence was damning. The baby's body had been discovered in a disused shed, wrapped in a plastic bag, discarded as though she had no worth. For the prosecution, this wasn't just a case of poor judgment. It was a calculated, callous disregard for a child's safety. They painted a picture of two people who had everything at their disposal: wealth, privilege, resources, and yet chose a dangerous, erratic lifestyle that left their infant daughter vulnerable. As Lidl spoke, there was a deep undercurrent of outrage in his voice. He was not just representing the state. He was representing every parent who had ever put their child's welfare above their own desires. The trial, in his eyes, wasn't just about the Martens' actions. It was about holding them accountable for the irreversible harm they had caused. And the public was watching, waiting for justice to be done. In stark contrast to the prosecution's case, Marten's defense presented a narrative of tragedy, not malice. Her legal team argued that the death of Victoria was a terrible accident. Marten, they claimed, was not an irresponsible, negligent parent, but a woman in a state of emotional distress, gripped by fear of the authorities and the impending separation from her daughter. Marten's counsel leaned heavily into the idea that she was, above all, a mother trying to protect her child from what she saw as a system designed to tear them apart. The prosecution's portrayal of neglect was, according to her lawyers, one-dimensional and cruel. They painted Marten as a woman pushed to the edge by her oppressive family and society, driven to act irrationally in an attempt to keep her daughters safe from an unforgiving world. Marten herself took the stand, her testimony a blend of defiance and vulnerability. "I was just trying to protect her," she said. "I didn't want them to take her away. I just wanted us to be left alone." It was a heartbreaking moment, full of contradictions. Marten's eyes were filled with tears, but there was no visible acknowledgement of the harm her actions had caused. She painted herself as the victim of her own choices, a woman who had been broken by her family's control, a mother who thought she was doing what was best, even as the facts told a different story. Mark Gordon, unlike Marten, chose to represent himself for part of the trial. His decision was puzzling to many, but it revealed a man who was unwilling to relinquish control, even in the most dire of circumstances. When he finally took the stand, his defense was one of self-pity and exasperation. He claimed that the whole situation had spiraled out of control, that he and Marten had been victims of a relentless police manhunt that had clouded their judgment. "I wasn't given a chance," Gordon said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We were just trying to survive. We weren't given a chance to make things right." His words, however, were hollow. There was no acknowledgement of the baby's suffering, no recognition of the chaos that his violent past had contributed to in the present. Gordon's silence on the death of Victoria spoke volumes. He never once expressed genuine remorse, nor did he show any deep understanding of the consequences of his actions. The defense framed his violent past as a result of a system that had failed him. His earlier assault charges were downplayed, dismissed as the acts of a man who had been shaped by an unjust world. The trial continued for months, but when it was time for the jury to deliberate, the tension reached its peak. The jury was tasked with answering one of the most difficult questions. Did the actions of Constance Marten and Mark Gordon lead directly to the death of their child? As the days passed, the jury grew increasingly divided. The evidence was there: Victoria's body, the neglect, the failure to seek medical care. But there was something intangible that stood between the jury and a unanimous verdict. The emotional complexity of the case, Marten's perceived victimhood, Gordon's detachment, the tragic circumstances of their flight, made it impossible for the jury to come to a conclusion without deep internal conflict. Was it negligence or something more? Was it a tragic accident? Or were they looking at the consequences of deliberate disregard for their child's life? The jury deliberated for a grueling 72 hours and 33 minutes. In the end, they found themselves at an impasse, unable to reach a unanimous verdict on the most serious charges. Finally, on June 19, 2024, Judge Mark Lucraft KC discharged the jury, unable to secure a consensus on the charges of manslaughter and child cruelty. However, they were able to reach a verdict on 2 counts. Marten and Gordon were found guilty of concealing the birth of a child and perverting the course of justice. The guilty verdicts were a small step toward justice, but they did little to heal the deep wounds of the case. Victoria Marten's death remained shrouded in mystery. The central question of how and why she had died was left unresolved, and the failure to reach a unanimous verdict on the most serious charges left the emotional weight of the trial hanging heavily over all those involved. The trial, though concluded for now, left lingering questions about justice and accountability. The convictions for perverting the course of justice and concealing Victoria's birth provided some closure, but they could not erase the deeper, unanswered questions. How had such a tragedy unfolded? Was it a failure of the parents, or a failure of society to see the signs of distress before it was too late? For Constance Marten and Mark Gordon, the legal battle was far from over. The retrial was already scheduled, and the haunting questions of responsibility and intent would be brought to light once again. But for the public, the emotional toll had been exacted. Victoria Marten's name would forever be linked to a tragic tale of a family's unraveling, and the echoes of her death would reverberate through the justice system for years to come.